All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Neha Singera, and I'm the Policy Director at the Berkeley Food Institute. And I'm very pleased to host today's webinar, which highlights recent research on farm worker safety and well-being. Today's webinar is part of the BFI Fall Policy Webinar Series. Previously, we've covered topics related to the California Farm to School grant evaluation. And coming up in our series, we will feature a webinar on December 5th, which is World Soils Day, on climate solutions in agriculture. And that webinar will focus specifically on soil management. For today's webinar on farm worker safety and well-being, I'm happy to announce our two speakers, Federico Castillo and Sam Ying. Federico Castillo is an environmental and agricultural economist with a PhD and undergraduate degrees from UC Berkeley. Federico's research centers technology transfer and innovation, economic valuation, socioeconomic impacts of climate change, and the economic aspects of protected areas and migration. He contributes in developing a research agenda on climate change, agriculture, and population issues in Berkeley. He is also engaged in research with scholars from the Tropical Agricultural Research Center, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and UC Davis in projects over ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change, the socioeconomic impact of weather extremes in California agriculture, and climate change impacts on migration from Mexico to the US. Welcome, Federico. Sam Ying is an associate professor of soil biogeochemistry in the Department of Environmental Sciences at University of California, Riverside. She also serves as co-director for the Center for Planetary Health, a part of the UC Global Health Institute. Sam's research and teaching focuses on chemical and biological processes within soils that shape water quality, food security, and the global cycles of critical elements such as carbon and nitrogen. Sam's work seeks to provide soil and water management practices for a healthy and sustainable future while training the leaders of tomorrow. Welcome, Sam. And before we dive into today's webinar, just a few housekeeping tips. Today's webinar will consist of 20-minute presentations, starting with Federico, followed by a 20-minute presentation from Sam. And we will leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions and answers from the audience. So as an audience member, you're encouraged to drop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can do that at any point of the webinar. You don't have to hold your questions to the end. So with that, I will turn it over to Federico. Thank you.
All right. Good midday, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Neha, for the introduction, which I now realize I had not sent you the shortened introduction, which that one is too long. You probably got tired after that one, but hopefully it was clear. And I want to thank the Berkeley Food Institute for inviting me to share some of the work that I do, which is interesting enough. We overlap, Sam and I overlap on some issues, and we also are part of planetary health, of course. And so I'm just delighted that this is a very sort of holistic session, if you will. And I want to thank those who took the time to show up in the middle of the day for this webinar. Of course, we know we compete with other activities, and we're just delighted that you're here instead of somewhere else. Okay, so today we're going to talk about farm workers and what I do in regards to farm workers. I think that the obvious, I will not state the obvious. The farm workers are extremely important to California agriculture and to what we eat every day, right? Uh, as an anecdote, I take the summer class that I teach here at Berkeley. I take students to do a field trip to visit farms and to talk to farm workers and farmers in the Central Coast. And every time we come back from those trips, the students say, Federico, I did not know farming was such a complicated thing. And farming is a complicated thing. And they say, well, some of them are sons of farm workers, but to be honest, many students just don't understand how difficult life for farm workers is in the current state of California agriculture. So this is the talk that we're gonna have, or the items that I'm gonna touch on. First is what do we mean by California agriculture? Then we're gonna talk about the compounding impacts of COVID-19, wildfires, chemical exposure, because oftentimes we talk about farm workers being exposed to this or that, but people don't realize that these things are layered up on top of farm workers at the same time in the same place, many instances. And I think that that's something we need to emphasize. I will discuss a couple projects that I've been working on, and then what would be the state of let me get my pen going. Oh shoot, sorry about that. I didn't mean to say that. Okay, where is my pen? Hmm, this one here. Okay, so this is basically a table telling you what are the most important crops in California agriculture. And this matters to this talk because some of these crops are very labor intensive and some others are not. So the impact of climate change on agricultural labor is varies according to the farm activity itself. So we see the milk cream is the most important income generation activity, and the broilers, chickens, turkeys, and whatnot are the least valuable in terms of value, and so the least sort of important, if you will. This doesn't say anything about the environmental impact that these activities have on our environment, but they just say something about the value. And we see almonds, pistachios, grapes being the second most valuable crop in California. This is updated with data from 2023. And the reason that I want to show the 2015 ranking that you see here is that basically things don't change much in California agriculture. The only crop that has kind of moved things up, the only two crops are almonds and pistachios. The rest of the crops remain where they are, right? So California agriculture is pretty static in terms of the crops that we grow. Again, this has an impact on farm labor that we will discuss later. So whereas here we were looking at the highest value crops, we're looking here at the counties that produce the most the most value, agricultural value. And so we see that Kern County is first, Imperial County is last, and the reason is very simple. Imperial County produce low value crops, if you will, a lot of grass, a lot of stuff like that, whereas the other counties produce grapes, a combination of grapes and cattle and almonds and whatnot, crops that are higher value. So what you see here is that, again, Fresno, Monterrey, Stanislaus, and Merced close up the top 5, 6 counties. And some of the crops that are grown in these counties are very labor intensive. Although mechanization is a trend in California, it has a speed up for reasons that we'll talk later. But what you see here is exactly that the top 5 counties are very highly diversified in terms of crops. Um, what does California agriculture looks like? Well, it looks like this pie chart. Most of California's agricultural labor is of Mexican descent, either first or second generation migrants or migrants themselves. You have United States, Puerto Rico, 25%, but this United States, Puerto Rico actually, pardon me, includes those who are U.S. citizens, and sometimes the census doesn't discriminate whether you are Mexican second generation and you are there. And then you have Central Americans, the Central Americans component of the agricultural labor force is increasing over time. We have more people from Guatemala and Nicaragua, particularly some from El Salvador working on the fields, particularly Guatemala. But and so we see also a larger indigenous population, which is not shown here, or indigenous component of the agricultural labor force. What does the age distribution looks like? You can, no surprises here. What you will be surprised is that this older farm worker segment is increasing. The California labor force, agricultural labor force is getting older. It looks more and more less second generation, and the female participation in the agricultural labor force has increased significantly. All this is the result of the policies that the governments have enacted, despite what Donald Trump says, or the the incoming president says that the true matter is that both Democratic and Republican administrations have implemented very restrictive immigration policies, which means less people crossing the border, and which means that then what we have in here is what we have. There is no growth in terms of migrants coming in, and so the age of the agricultural labor force, the average age is increasing as well for the same reason that I just explained. And about a half of the agricultural labor force do not have authorization to work in the United States. They are undocumented. And so we need to also think in terms of these issues. Okay, so if we're gonna have mass deportations coming up, what's gonna happen with the agricultural labor force? What's gonna happen with food prices? What's gonna happen to agricultural production in general, particularly for the crops that are labor intensive, right? Okay, so I will share with you now one of my research projects is on the heat impacts on farm workers. This is the research team, and we're missing Montserrat and Susana Matias. And I just made a note myself that I forgot to erase that at the bottom right, but uh, as Montserrat and Susana, but they are key components of our research team right now. So we have a very multidisciplinary team. I love working on multidisciplinary teams. David Lopez Carr from UC Santa Barbara, Jennifer Banos from Arizona State, Armando Sanchez from UNAM in Mexico, Michael Wenner from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, yours truly with a very picture that I look very young, of course, old picture. And then we are funded by PIMSA, who a program that no longer exists, unfortunately, and the UC Mexos part of Alianza, the Alianza UC Mexico Alianza program, and Planetary Health. And so what do we do here is we basically try to figure out how heat impacts farm workers. Let me stress from the beginning. The impact of heat on farm workers has been, there are two things that have been going on. First of all, people think that the impact of heat on farm worker is linear. In other words, an increase in temperature from 95 to 100 Fahrenheit degrees is the same thing as an increase in temperature from 70 to 75 degrees. We argue that that is not the case, that as the temperature increases, I will use I will use heat and temperature. They're not the same, but for the purposes of this talk, I will use the same. I will use them interchangeably. We argued that the impact of the 95 to 100 is far more deadly, and it impacts more productivity than the 70 to 75. That makes sense, but the research has not been done that way. And so we found a way to go around this. And basically what this graph does is a lot of arrows and whatever, but it's basically, the thing is, a farmer is exposed to these two things here, solar rays and infrared stuff. And then there are several things that happen to that. That either is absorbed by the farmer, right? And then the farmer goes to evaporation and respiration right here. Or it hits the ground and again it impacts the farmer right back up. And so farmers are are impacted by this when it comes down to heat. And there are several ways to measure, like the Weld bulb GT, which is just a metric. It's a way of measuring heat. There is the thermal comfort, whereas what this measure is how farmers, depending on the clothing that they use, how comfortable they are. But basically, this is the story of heat. Comes from above, it hits the ground and bounces right back to the person right there, who is, of course, bending and doing the work, and the person responds via perspiration and other processes. We wanted to do an impact of heat on labor, on agricultural productivity, on the crop through labor, meaning how are farm workers impacted and how that results in agricultural productivity in terms of harvesting, the speed of harvesting, and so on and so forth. We choose to do this in these counties here, which, no surprise, are part of the top 5 agricultural production counties that I show you. But not only are they the top part of the top 5 agricultural producing counties, They are the counties where more deaths related to heat occur and where higher degree of heat indexes, the heat index is higher. So I think that this is pretty much matches the requirements of the project. And what we did was is each crop has a what is called a crop labor requirement. How many man hours or how many labor hours are required to harvest 1 acre of fill in the blank, grapes, onions, whatever. What's the effort required? And so we wanted to know how heat impacts this labor requirement. In other words, the theory is that the more heat, the longer it takes to harvest, right? Because people get slower impacted negatively by the heat. And so we did the heat incidence on this crop labor requirement. So we had a ton of data on heat index. This is the stage one. And then the stage two is how this crop labor requirement is impacted by agriculture, by impacts the agricultural productivity. Meaning how many tons of stuff can be harvested from a given acre of land. That's basically it. Heat impacting you going to harvest and becoming slower and less productive as you move along because of the heat. And then again, the hypothesis is that as heat increases, there is a need to hire more labor to make up for the labor productivity losses. A consequence is that as more workers are hired, more of them are negatively impacted by heat. But think about this. This is a vicious cycle, right? Farmers during heat days have to harvest. The crop needs to be harvested. Crop doesn't wait. And so farmers have two options here. They hire more people or they ask people to work for longer hours. These are the only two options the farmer has. On both options, the farm worker is the one that comes up on the short end of the stick because either the farm worker is exposed longer or is asked to work longer, even when the heat is not necessarily that high. And so forget about the left part. Well, I mean, you can take a look at that as long as you don't get a headache. But basically, the results actually validate what we say. As the heat index increases, the cost increases, the labor cost increases, meaning heat imposes a cost on the farmer. As the heat increases, the crop labor requirement increases. Farm workers are required to work for longer period of times. Uh, in the second stage, we learned that to keep production, meaning to keep getting the same tonnage of the crop, you need to increase the number of hours labor work. And again, this exposes farm workers even more than they were already exposed. Or farmers need to increase acreage. Now, the problem with that is that California acreage pretty much accounted for. And there is no land out there frontier that we can go and increase acreage of onions and melons or whatever. And so this is a trap, and that's why it's not significantly statistically significant, I think. But it makes sense, right? We did this for onions and melons because these are two very different crops. Melons is extremely labor intensive, and onions is becoming mechanized, but still a little bit labor intensive. Okay, so what's the problem now with farm workers? Okay, Federico, you did the stuff, cool, awesome, on heat. What is the major threat that we have nowadays that continues to be a problem? And we did this paper here that I'm showing you when COVID was more of a factor, but it continues to be a factor. And what we argue is that the policies that the policies that promote, the policies that are implemented to promote, to reduce the exposure to COVID actually counter the policies that are promoted to reduce the exposure to heat. And let me just walk you through one of them. So the COVID-19 precautions start here, and we ask people to wear a mask. But the problem with wearing a mask is that when you are working under heat conditions, the mask become an issue. It's a generally discomfort. We ask people to do social distancing during COVID or to reduce COVID, but the problem is that we ask farm workers to go to a shaded area to seek refuge from heat. In other words, we're asking people to cluster themselves together and so on and so forth. So as you can see, it requires, this is a spoiler alert. The policies that we try to implement, we need to be more creative, and I will show you what I mean by that at the end. In the end, what we do for COVID exacerbates heat health issues, makes them worse. And the same thing applies to extreme heat. If we were to look at what we suggest for heat, one of them is air conditioning. Well, guess what? Air conditioning requires for you to shut your windows, close your doors, and turn that thing on, and everybody's gonna be either indoors or in a closed area. That in turn promotes or makes COVID situations more complicated. Okay? And the same logic goes for all the other two. At the end, what we promote to reduce heat basically make a little bit more complicated when it comes down to COVID conditions. So you see, farm workers are exposed to this kind of double whammy, and then we go from there. The same thing happens with wildfires and so on and so forth. And just to speed up things a little bit, the same thing happens with pesticide use. You can see it here. The left two maps, this one and this one, show at different points in time where chemicals are used the most in the state of California. Not surprisingly, you have the Central Valley, the Central Coast, and the Imperial Valley areas. And guess what? The hottest places in California, when it comes down to heating this was a map prepared by my colleague Michael Wenner, are the places where pesticide use is the heaviest. So again, think about this. I just show you that farm workers are impacted by COVID, or at least we discussed that. I didn't show you. We have some data to prove that, which is not shown in this presentation. And then now I'm telling you that on top of that, there is chemical use, heavy chemical use, where farm workers are located. So it's all of these very complex things. Just to close off, I will mention a couple projects that we're working on. One of them is the UC Mexico Farmer Labor Research Cluster. These are what we aim to do, and the logic is very simple. Farm workers in Mexico and farm workers in California are exposed, exactly on the same things: heavy chemical use, COVID, heat waves. They are impacted by housing conditions. They show mental health issues as well on both sides of the border. So the aim here is to get people together. Mexicans know a hell of a lot about Mexican farm workers. UC researchers know a lot about California farm workers, and I think getting them together and doing research together will help to move the agenda forward when it comes down to policies. And the workers are the same, right? I just told you that the 69% of farm workers in California are of Mexican origin, one way or another. So this project is ongoing. We have 4 pillars, as you can see there: data and technology, health community, law and immigration, agricultural production. And then we have 3 topics or 3 areas that touches on all of those: gender, climate change, climate, and socially disadvantaged communities. So we are developing working groups that look into these sort of pillars and this cross-sectional thing. We have a workshop that starts tomorrow and ends on Friday. I'll be happy to send the Zoom. Maybe some of you want to check out the presentations there. I'm also part of a University of California, Santa Cruz that is led by Marta Spark. The University of California, Santa Cruz, Sam is part of that project too. The Climate Action Sea Grant Farm Workers and Climate Change. And again, what we try to do here is very practical. There is nothing fancy here. What are the tools that we can develop to help farm workers cope with climate change? Understanding that the position of farm work, socially speaking, is at a disadvantage, that the power structure is at a disadvantage there. So I'm going to leave the link there. You can go and see some of the stuff. So how can we do for policy to close up here? I'm saying policy must be grounded in community needs. That's the way to go. And I will show you one example. The last slide will be that one. Policy needs to be practical. We already know everything we need to know. We know that we need to provide shade structures to farm workers, that we need to provide clean water for them to drink, that we need to have better housing. So the issue here is, how do we move the needle? Well, we know this. Again, the issue is to have communities participation on this and researchers pushing policymakers in the right direction on that. And I think the fact that some of farm workers are now eligible for example, for healthcare through medical is a huge advancement. Not all of them, and the requirements are so ridiculous that most of farm workers don't qualify for this benefit. I'm sorry, I sound like venting, but I'm just when I look at the requirements for this eligibility, it's like, what the hell were they thinking, right? Okay. And we need to empower farm workers, and that's what the project does. The second project that I mentioned, led by UC Santa Cruz, and I'll be happy to discuss that a little bit more. But this is one way when community is contacted, when community is included, uh, things get better. This is a prototype of a mobile rest area for farm workers. This was generated with California state funds by LEAP, the LEAP Institute in Huron. And what you have here is a mobile station where farm workers can go and rest. They're not crowded, but not only that, it also has air filters. So you're not only relieving heat stress, you're also helping with the air quality that they breathe during while they're resting. Is solar powder, is powered by solar energy. And this was actually invented, if you will, created by the community. Then they got together with some engineers and they came up with this concept. So this is one example of how money, policy, investments can go to generate some kind of knowledge. These are prototypes, but I I can assure you that this idea works. I saw it myself. It makes sense. It's mobile. You can take it to farms when they are needed. And so this is one example, right? Okay, that's all I have to say. I don't know if I hope I didn't put you to sleep there. And thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Neha. And I'm gonna stop. Don't
Thank you so
keep.
much, Federico, for an
Yes.
incredible presentation and giving us so much compelling research and information and tying it up at the end with such a succinct policy call to action. Sam, I'll turn it over to you to start your presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Let me make sure that this is visible. Does that look good to everyone?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Federico. That was really interesting. And also, I'm really stoked that, of course, we've been working together for a long time. I'm really excited that our research topics really converge in thinking about climate change, environmental exposures in a really holistic sense, that we're, as people, we experience air, water, soil, food. And so Federico talked about heat, and I'm going to move forward on water, which, you know, is very essential for life. So my specialty, I guess you would say, is geochemistry. And I'm going to talk about water. And when we think about water and jeopardize water resources, especially in California, we're thinking about lack of access to safely managed water still, which is really fascinating because a lot of times people think that that's something that's happening abroad, but we have huge issues with water access here in our own country and in our own state. But across the world, we have 2 billion people who still lack access to safely managed water, as estimated by the UN. And here we think a lot about drought and that we're running out of water. And the quantity of the water makes a really big difference in affecting the quality of the water. So even when we have some water to drink, we still need to ensure that it's safe. And so focusing in on California, we worked with a really amazing team, and I'm just showing some of the key players here. A lot of our work is being led by Miranda Vega, who is a PhD student in our research group. And there's a couple of maps that I'm including that was created by our master's student, Monica Hope. But two of our really close collaborators come from community-based organizations and policy organizations, including Pueblo Unido Community Development Corporation, and then also Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. And the two women we work with are Yaneth and Natalie, who are just superhuman. So we're going to zoom even farther into a region called Eastern Coachella Valley or East Valley. And it's down in southern California in Riverside County. And Eastern Coachella Valley is made up of 4 unincorporated areas, including Thermal, Mecca, Oasis, and North Shore. And you might recognize this region for the very famous, or for some of us, infamous festival of Coachella Music Festival. So it's very close to the Salton Sea. And in this area, it is a huge agricultural production region. Production in this area exceeds 600 million a year, and making up for half of the agricultural revenue of that entire region. But at the same time, after bringing all this revenue in, 65% of the residents are 2 times below the federal poverty limit. And about 80% of the residents there are undocumented Latinx or indigenous groups, and making up the largest disenfranchised population in the region. And to top it off, they often live in really crowded, very substandard dwellings. And very tightly linked to that problem became this slight solution, which was in 1992 passed the Polanco bill in our state, which allowed the creation of what are called Polanco parks, which is just another term for these business tax exempt and sometimes some regulations exempt mobile home parks that are allowed to have 14 total units or 12 houses. And it's specifically only allowed to have farm workers live there. So these Polancos are all over this region. There's estimates of 110 or so by the Coachella Valley Water District, but because they are supposed to be built almost like temporary housing, they kind of pop up and some of them disappear, units degrade, and the tracking of these units and wells that they're tapping is very fuzzy and poorly documented. So to top it off, regulation in this region is really complex because it's happening across this checkerboard landscape. The squares that you see there are tribal lands, specifically the Torres Martinez Reservation here closer to the Salton Sea. And you can see that makes it really complicated on how the parks and the water is regulated in this landscape. And one of the major problems is that arsenic is pervasive in the groundwater here. So as we go, unfortunately, from the north where there's way less arsenic, where people are much wealthier and can actually afford water treatment or are even connected to municipal treated water, they have the least amount of trouble with arsenic. But as you get closer to the sea, because of the geology underneath the soil, the shallower your aquifer is there, the more arsenic we're reaching. And so unfortunately, in those unincorporated regions that I pointed out, they're actually seeing the highest arsenic concentrations in their water. So how do we tap into this groundwater? In general, in our country, we have 2 major ways of tapping into our groundwater, which we're more and more dependent on because of lack of surface water. Climate change is making it harder for us to get water from rain, and so we're going underground. So the 2 main types of wells that we can access groundwater are domestic wells and public supply wells. And there are a number of major differences. Domestic wells serve fewer people, and they are the responsibility of the well owner. So they tend to be shallower because shallower wells are not as expensive, but they are not monitored and they're unregulated. So to make sure that that water is safe, the owner of the well has to do all that work themselves and pay for all of it. Whereas public supply wells serve communities that are on municipal water sources. And so that water is much deeper in the ground, which usually means that it's much more dependable. Those wells run dry very rarely. There are lots of regulations that make sure that the water is safe because it's very closely and regularly monitored for water quality. So going back to what the Polancos or the mobile home parks that are for farm workers, which type of well are they tapping into? And they are technically not domestic wells. They are regulated public supply wells. However, they actually fall in this funky regulatory gap because they are labeled as, quote, state small water systems. And that is specifically for water systems or wells that serve 5 to 14 connections or 25 people for more than 60 days a year. And what that means is those are really small communities, and all of the Polancos necessarily fall into this category. And the problem is those wells tend to actually be somewhere between these two in terms of the physical depth of them and also their regulation. So they are usually regulated not federally or by the state, but they're actually very locally regulated by the county. So this is an example of a screenshot. Well, it's not the text from the Department of Environmental Health for the County of Riverside that regulates these state small systems that the Polancos are using to tap into the groundwater. And one of the main things that they have to do every year is send an annual consumer notice to the customers that are using these wells. And they state specifically in that statement that the state regulatory requirements for operation of a state small water system are less extensive than the requirements for large public water systems. And that's it. And to know what less extensive means, you really have to dig into the codes of the regulations. And in general, one of the biggest differences is that these wells only need to ever, after the wells are installed, be tested for chemicals once. That is the minimum, or that is the only guideline. And whereas large public water systems like Coachella Valley Water District, they're required to test quarterly. So one of the biggest things is monitoring is going to be much less in these small systems. So that all came up and became a reality for many of these parks throughout Coachella Valley because arsenic was found throughout all of these wells as you get closer and closer to the Salton Sea. And it was actually a story about a large mobile home park called Oasis, but there are 4 other smaller Polancos that also have really high arsenic, and their wells had arsenic concentrations that exceeded the health guideline of 10 parts per billion. And so in general, these mobile home parks are served by one groundwater well. And what is really notable is they lack wellhead treatment. In other words, whatever the houses are getting is straight up what is being pumped out of the ground. So there's no arsenic treatment. There's no other type of treatment, not even chlorine most of the time. And a lot of times people ask, well, maybe they can just be consolidated with the large water district, which means that you physically feed a pipe from the Coachella Water District to all of these mobile home parks so that they are served treated water. The problem is financial and physical. So a lot of these parks are very rural. So the actual infrastructure to build to them is lacking. So we need a solution that is essentially a decentralized water access solution. So that's when we connected with Pueblo Unido CDC. They are a community-based organization that is run by community members from Eastern Coachella Valley who experience this contaminated water themselves. And what they did was apply for a whole bunch of different grants and work really closely with the state and the EPA to get money to install reverse osmosis systems, which is the best decentralized treatment system that you can get to remove the arsenic. And they installed it at all of the parks that have arsenic in their groundwater well that is greater than 10 parts per billion, which is the maximum contaminant level. And so to date, they've installed over 400 of these treatment systems. And the way it looks is that you have this pump that has a giant filter, and it is under the kitchen sink, and you flow water through it, and it's just run by pressure, and it pushes the water through this giant filter, and it comes out as this tap that's right next to their regular untreated kitchen tap. So our team was brought in because even though technically all these home units now have arsenic-free water that they can just straight up drink and be supposedly totally healthy, at least from the drinking water side, the problem is that there is something called incidental exposure. And I will walk you through what that means. So in these homes, originally before they got the water treatment, they just had untreated arsenic contaminated water flowing into their homes. And in these homes, there's only 3 major places that you're going to access water that's piped in: at their kitchen, and then in their bathroom, both through their bathroom sink and their bathroom shower. And right now, the only treated tap that these homes have is that little RO treated tap that's right next to their kitchen untreated tap. And there are all these other ways that people can be actually still exposed to the arsenic contaminated water. And so our team has come in and sampled all of the untreated taps, all 3 of the other untreated taps in hundreds of these mobile home units over the last year. And we analyzed the arsenic and other metals concentration in that water. And so what we found is that when we focus in on something, on the incidental ingestion, for example, when you're bathing your child and they are, if you have children or have seen children take showers or baths, I know that when I was little, I would just open my mouth and just drink the water. And so that can be a significant volume if your arsenic concentrations are really high. And so this is an example data set from a number of units within the Oasis Mobile Home Park that we sampled at a couple of years ago. And you can see that the variation between the arsenic concentrations from the kitchen, bathroom, and shower taps are not super different. In this case, they are all way above the health-based limit of 10 parts per billion, which is marked here with this red dotted line. And if we assumed the worst case scenario of the concentration being around 80 to 90 parts per billion, a 5-kilogram child only needs to consume 1 tablespoon of this water to reach their maximum allowable daily intake amount of arsenic. So this is a huge potential problem. And that's why we're working with the community to sample as many of these parks as possible so we can build the database to push towards something called point of entry treatment. So the way point of entry would work is that you still have this contaminated water that's getting piped into your home, but instead of just putting it at the kitchen tap, we put an entire treatment outside of the home that treats the water that's coming into all of the taps. And so then now you should have treated water that is arsenic free going into your kitchen and your bathroom taps all together. The problem is that point of entry treatment units are much more expensive. They're harder to maintain. And so there is a lot of funding and community training that's needed to make sure that these treatment options are actually viable. So the other portion of our work looks at tap water distrust. So we've sampled all of these units and we talk to the residents often about their use of the water. And in these conversations, we notice that there's really variable trust and a lot of distrust of the tap in general, including the one that's treated. And the problem with this is because they're avoiding the treated tap, as much as 25% of their monthly household income is being spent on bottled water. And so one of the things that we're doing with Pueblo Unido is asking this question of what is the tap water perception of residents? And if there's distrust, what's the reason? And so we're in the process of doing focus groups and creating surveys to really understand what the sources of distrust are, in case there is a way, not in case, but to use that information to design community outreach and educational programs with Pueblo Unido to sway people's behavior toward really using the RO tap, which is very long-term, not very simple process. So as Federico mentioned, we're on a project together that is led by UC Santa Cruz Professor Matt Spark in the Global Health Program. And we create these trainings for promotores that is to really just know the basics of water and water safety and how to know more about your water quality and what your rights are to that information. And so using that foundation, we're going to use these surveys and really tailor those trainings to the Coachella community. So just to throw these out there, there's lots of really amazing organizations and research groups throughout the UCs and at Stanford that are working on water equity that we partner with sometimes. And so I just wanted to throw these up there and can share their names if you're interested. But a lot of them do really different aspects of water equity and policy. To wrap up, I just want to comment that going back to the bigger picture, I think it's really important that we think of people holistically and how we interact with our environment, and particularly the impact of climate change on different communities, and how this has how some of our work is trying to contribute to closing what's called the climate gap, where some really wealthy communities are not really having to feel the impacts of climate, whereas like our Eastern Coachella Valley communities, they are really, really feeling it. And so it's just a reminder that this is a really huge equity issue. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was an extremely interesting presentation. And I have a quick question for you, just to clarify. You had mentioned a percentage of income that folks in your study are spending on bottled water. Can you just remind me what that percentage was?
So I want to make it super clear that that's very anecdotal with a very small percentage of the homes that we talked to, but averaging across them, it was 25%.
25%.
But
wow.
Yeah, but the specific note there is that is a chunk of research that needs to be done to really solidify that number.
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you for clarifying that. That's such a high proportion as well. Federico, did you want to weigh in?
I want to add to that. This is very important. I'm in Mexico City now, and as the plane lands in the Mexico City International Airport, what do you see? I always ask the students who are from Mexico City who come to visit, or relatives or whatever. What do you see? Water tanks in the roofs, tons of water tanks in the roofs, because the quality of the water here is very bad. It imposes a cost on households, particularly low-income households, to buy water treatment tanks and filters and whatever, so they can brush their teeth and do the normal stuff that we sometimes take for granted where we live. And that usually is a very large cost. I don't know what the cost is. I don't know a study that show, but there are studies that show that the cost is significant, particularly for low-income communities. So it's not only in rural areas, it is important also in urban areas as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Federico. So I'll turn to some questions now. We have one question from the audience that is asking, and I think this is for Sam. What does the water treatment technology, the reverse osmosis technology, does it address other contaminants in the drinking water, like pesticides or other biological elements in the water?
Yeah, thanks so much. I actually just typed some of the answer, but yeah, RO can definitely get rid of lots of other contaminants, including pesticides and other metals, and then some microbes. I just noted there though, because the filter is a really, really fine filter that is actually lots and lots of layers of filters, depending on how much contamination and the combination of what type they can often get clogged. So that is actually the major problem, is there's a threshold of how contaminated your water can be before you can get a lot of malfunctioning, which is why it's great when you look at the fact that it can treat lots of different things that are otherwise hard to treat. But maintenance is really important with RO, and because they are such complex instruments, they require specialized people to come fix it. So that's the biggest drawback.
Thank you. Thanks for answering the question, and thanks to the person that submitted that. For the next question, maybe we can turn to Federico. So you had mentioned in your presentation that the age of farm workers is increasing. And I'm just curious, do you have any high-level thoughts on how the aging population then influences the conversation policymakers and farmers are having related to well-being and safety for an aging farm worker population?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. That's an important, aging population meaning is a slow-moving demographic process, right? It's not like you have in the 2024 41 years of age, and then in 2026 52. It's a very slow-moving process. So this allows policymakers to adjust. Now, in all fairness, technology is going to make a difference in regards to that. Why? Because technology will replace some farm workers. I just saw a video the other day about a apple harvested robot. Crazy. It does the job very well, except that it doesn't do it well enough. For example, it picks 90% of the time, it picks the right apple, right? And it has suction cups, and it just goes around with sensors and chooses what apple to pick. Um, to be economically feasible, I understand, and what I was told, it needs to be about 96% efficient. And it's a big leap to get from 90 to 96. The machine needs to be improved by a lot, believe it or not. There needs to be a lot of adjusting. And what it on the other hand, it only emphasizes how important are farm workers. It means that a human being is actually doing the job well enough 96% of the time under the worst of conditions. And so, anyways, so technology will play a role. So enhancing technologies that replace farm workers. I know people don't like this. They say it generates unemployment. Yes, but again, with an aging population, the unemployment impact would be mitigated a little bit. And I think the other solution that they're promoting now is the F2 visas. Um, that's a double-edged sword in terms of labor conditions. There's no guarantee that F2 visa recipients will be better off than the current farm worker in-house, if you will, or housing California will be. And anyways, at this point in time, H2 visas are about 5 to 7% of the total farm labor force. And that it is not a solution that is. So I think a technology, F2 visas properly regulated, will play a role in terms of that demographic and the participation, the participation of the female labor force, of the females in the labor force will also mitigate some of that. But
Thank you,
females
Federico.
pose a different challenge, right? So there's issues about women rights and gender issues that need to be addressed. Yeah, thank you.
Federico, so we have time for one final question. And so in this last minute, do you mind answering this question from an audience member? Have you engaged farm owners in your research, and how have they responded?
Okay, thank you for that. Difficult group to if you're doing research on farm labor and you want to engage farmers themselves or farm owners, good luck with that. But I say, believe it or not, geographically areas matters. In the Central Valley is very complicated. Farm owners don't like folks like me showing up. It's not because I'm not against farmers. I mean, I love farmers. I love visiting farms. I like to get my boots dirty and going and talking to farm. I grew up on a farm, so I'm all for that. But they don't see folks like me in a very unless you have a very good long-standing relationship. However, in the Central Coast, I have interviewed many a farmer, particularly farmers of color, small farmers, and we talk about labor, and they express what the one thing that I discussed with you. Geez, man, it's taking me forever to hire labor. I don't have access to as much labor as I used to. Labor is becoming more expensive, more scarce. So on the Central Coast, I'm able to, thanks to a project that I work with Professor Tim Bowles, and I have developed some networks as a result of that. But in the Central Valley is a different situation. And I imagine in the Imperial Valley is equally complicated, probably. Although I'm not. Yeah, some would say something about that, probably.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that question. And thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar today. We really hope that it was valuable and informative for your work. And thank you to our speaker, Sam and Federico, for presenting your research. We will plan to upload a recording of this webinar onto the BFI YouTube website. So if you would like to revisit the content presented today, you can go ahead and do that shortly. Thank you, everyone. I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon. See you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.